Thanks for joining us, Mike. Really excited to have you here. Obviously knowing you, I know your background is fascinating. So excited to share a little bit of that with the attendees. I think that's a pretty good start. Why don't you tell us about what your background is? I know we were talking a little bit earlier about you're from Texas and your path through life, but why don't you tell us how you got to where you are as the director of a USD R&D organization?
Okay. Well, as you point out, grew up in Texas and then went to college in Boston at Harvard. Was there for a couple of years working after college, and then came out to Stanford Business School, met my wife in my class, started working at a disk drive company, stayed there long enough to be the CEO. At the end of that, the company was Quantum, so disk drives, tape drives, computer storage devices. Learned a lot about computer hardware in that role, and then worked with a lot of smaller companies, some in the music business, because I'm an amateur musician. As Ridwick knows, I play in a dance band, and I've played for the Defense Innovation Unit when we have an annual dinner dance when you can get together for things like that. And then was the CEO of Symantec, the cybersecurity firm. And it was at that point that I learned about the Defense Innovation Unit. And you're never really through answering that question, what are you going to do next in life? And I wanted something where I could learn. And this has been a fabulous opportunity to learn about the military, what it needs to do to modernize, which basically is a lot of using commercial technology. As Ritwig knows, we're trying to incorporate AI and quite a bit that we're doing at this point. And it's been an incredible ride there for the last 4 years. And I've been leading DIU for the last 2 years. So I've been fortunate to have a number of interesting jobs, but this is the best job I've ever had in my life. I'm really enjoying it.
So you went from Symantec, which is an antivirus security company, to DIU, which is a national security organization. So while linguistically similar, I think antivirus and national security are pretty dissimilar. How did you make that jump? What inspired you to join DIU?
You know, when I was at Symantec, I noticed that one of the things I enjoyed the most was the opportunity to work with government organizations that were fighting cybercrime. So I had the opportunity to meet Director Mueller of the FBI, Director Comey. We worked with several international governments, GCHQ in the UK, Australian cyber security organization. I found that was some of the most interesting work for me because it was different. I was introduced to that mission. And of course, some of the work, as you know, from what we're doing at DIU is pretty fascinating because of the problems that we're asked to solve. I had an opportunity to meet Admiral Rogers at the NSA. So I just got thinking, I wonder if there's anything that would make sense in government. And I didn't know whether there would be or not, but I met my predecessor, Raj Shah, who had a military background, a former F-16 pilot. He said, well, I'm not sure, but there's one thing that we need to do urgently, and I could really use some help, and it's to understand what China is doing with their early stage investments. They're doing quite a bit of investing in Silicon Valley and Boston and other innovation hubs. And we want to understand, this is a request that came from then Secretary of Defense Ash Carter and the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs at that time, General Paul Selva. And so it was an opportunity to produce something for them, and I had no idea at the time where that would lead.
Gotcha. And so that's what got you into DIU.
Mm-hmm.
So, obviously I know what DIU's mission is, of course, but maybe our attendees don't. So why don't you tell us a little bit about kind of, you've been at DIU, as you mentioned, for 2 years now. What is the mission statement, and what is kind of the vision that you have for DIU?
Ridwick and I can laugh about this because I think it's very important to know what the mission statement is, especially if you work there. So what I did for the first 6 all-employee, all-hands meetings that we had was quiz people on the mission, make sure everybody could recite it. The mission has 3 components, and it really comes from Ash Carter's vision that there's so much more research and development that's happening in the commercial world than there is purely in the military world. In fact, a pretty interesting statistic is that in 1960, defense-related R&D, so we're talking what the Pentagon does plus the defense contractors at that point in time. So in 1960, that was 36% of global R&D. So it's just staggering to imagine that. So more than a third of what was happening in the world was U.S. defense-related. Today, that number is 3.6%. So it's dramatically changed because so many other countries are doing a lot of investment in R&D, and R&D in our country has shifted to the private sector. So Ash Carter realized that and said, for the military to have the access to leading edge technology, we got to be working with the private sector. We got to be co-located where they are, which is why DIU set up in Boston and Austin and Silicon Valley. And we got to make sure that we have a way to access that, which wasn't all that clear when he set DIU up. We can talk a little bit about that. So that really was the origin of DIU, and the mission was to accelerate the adoption of commercial technology into the military. And then when I interviewed with Secretary Jim Mattis for the job, he emphasized that, okay, that we do want to do that, but we also want to make sure that because DIU is a small organization, we transform the capabilities of the Defense Department. We introduce new capabilities. So he had the idea that we need to punch above our weight as a small organization. We're about 100 people. That's small in the 3 million person organization that is the Department of Defense. So we need to make sure we're working on projects that can really transform capability, can go across the services, can do big things, basically. So that's part of our mission too, to transform through new capabilities. And then the third part of our mission is really to strengthen something that's called out in the National Defense Strategy that Secretary Mattis put together. And it's called the National Security Innovation Base. And the concept is we need to move beyond what has traditionally been called the defense industrial base. That's Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed, Raytheon, all the traditional defense contractors. We need those folks, but we also need to tap into what's happening in the leading edge companies developing technology in America. And that's what we need to do to reach the leaders in AI, autonomous systems, cyber, and other fields. So those are the three elements of DIU's mission: accelerate adoption of commercial technology in the military, transform capabilities or introduce new capabilities, and strengthen the national security innovation base.
Got it. So, I mean, it's clear to me that the DoD recognizes the importance of new commercial technology to strengthen our national security and the innovation that we have within the DoD. But how have our federal R&D funding priorities shifted to reflect that? I guess, change in priorities. Have they shifted, and if so, how?
Well, I think this is an opportunity for DIU to bring extra value to the department, because if we work with commercial technology, we ought to be doing that at a lower cost than if we had to develop that technology ourselves. So I'm not sure that I would say the priorities have shifted, except to the extent that we have outsourced some of the R&D to the private sector. The Defense Department still needs to develop some technologies that are purely military. Examples would be hypersonics, with the ability to, as you know, send something through the air that's at Mach 5 or faster. Directed energy, which is all about what can we do with laser technology that can be a weapon. So those things are not going to be developed by the commercial sector. So that's where the Defense Department is spending a lot of its R&D. And then to the extent it can leverage or use what's developed commercially, we want to do that to the maximum extent possible. So I think that's a little bit about how it shifted. In general, you're touching on something that's a passion of mine. We've benefited so much in this country by the spillover effects of federally funded R&D. So in the 1960s, there was tremendous R&D investment during the space race. In fact, at that time, we invested 2% of our GDP in federally funded R&D. A lot of that going to the space program. And we've had so many benefits from that, whether it's the internet or GPS, miniaturized electronics, so many things that have built a very robust economy upon which the innovation hubs, Boston, Silicon Valley, Pittsburgh, and other places now have very thriving communities of startups, venture capital, and they're all leveraging that federally funded R&D, because only the federal government can invest in these technologies or programs that have a very long time horizon and are very uncertain. It's a little bit of a misnomer that venture capital is investing in risky things. They invest in new business models, but they rarely invest in new technology. They want the technology to be proven, because they know that that can be uncertain. It can take a long time to ensure that the technology works. So we benefit so much by that, and that has been on the decline since the 1960s. The federally funded proportion of GDP has gone from 2% down to 0.7, half of which is spent in health-related areas, which is a great thing during a pandemic. We probably should have been spending more there. But that means the national security-related technologies, 2% down to 0.35. That's not, we need to be doing a lot more there in federal government investment in R&D if we want to compete with China, a country that has 30 to 50-year time horizons. It looks like we think we've won in the technology space and the R&D race, and we don't need to invest anymore, but we all know that's not true. We have to be investing if we want to be leading in technologies for the next 30, 40, or 50 years.
So a lot of the students here, Silicon Valley, Stanford, Harvard, et cetera, what have you, these big innovation campuses have strong tie-ins, right? Either through tech transfer or joining early stage startups in kind of the more consumer facing, consumer electronics or, consumer hardware kind of startup ventures. What is the applicability of our campuses, right? Our research campuses and their entrepreneurship programs to national security, and how can they play in that field?
Well, first, building on the last point, we need to see more money flowing from the federal government to these fantastic research institutions. I mean, let's face it, this is a world-class asset that the United States has. We need to be figuring out how to build that and make it even more capable. So whether it's the world-class research institutions, academia, or our national labs, we need to be revitalizing that. So that's something I wish our government were doing more. Of course, you got to create room in the budget for that. And that would make the universities themselves even stronger and be able to have more programs, fund more scholarships, attract more students. But to your question directly, how do we benefit from a national security standpoint because of the consumer-oriented technologies that the folks are learning and then going to work in? Actually, tremendously, because of there are 20 modernization priorities that were just released by the National Security Council. And of those, 18 are commercial technologies. The research and engineering organization within the Defense Department, where DIU sits, that is the area where Richard and I work, there's 10 different modernization priorities that have been established there. 8 of those are commercial. So these commercial technologies, whether it's AI, autonomous systems, biotechnology, these are the areas that are critical for national defense. And we've got to draw on the companies that are developing leading edge commercial technologies. A good example would be the gaming industry. So what could be more consumer friendly than that? And you'd think that has no applicability to defense whatsoever. Actually not true, and you probably know this, there's no better sector for what is the human interface with a lot of sensor inputs than the gaming industry. So this actually is something we can use when we think about defense applications. It's that human to sensor or human to machine interface where gaming is important. And of course, we're seeing AI introduced into everything. So whether it's autonomous systems, where we've got a project underway right now that's called artificial intelligence for small unit maneuver, basically. That sounds like a lot of jargon. It's swarms of drones. You can't have swarms of drones if you don't have applications of AI involved. We've got another project in our human systems or health portfolio. It's about how can we assist those specialist technicians who are looking at radiology diagrams, or those that are looking at images to understand whether a patient has a particular type of cancer. We're using AI to help us understand and assist those operators so that they're not having to study every pixel. The machine helps them by saying, please look at this area, this looks suspicious. So we're seeing AI infused into everything that we're doing at DIU. Very important for national security, obviously.
Got it. So if I were a student today at Carnegie Mellon, any of these places, and I wanted to get more involved with national security, you'd say that joining, any one of these commercial ventures is still a very strong way to contribute back to our national security and our mission that we have at DIU.
I would say that in general, as a country, we need to be encouraging more focus on STEM education. We need to be drawing more from the commercial sector. So by working in these fields, you're helping make our country stronger, our economy stronger. And then our mission at DIU is, okay, how do we tap into that for the military? So that is a contribution to national security in terms of making sure that the US is leading in these, what I call game-changing technologies, where you have to say AI, autonomous systems, biotech. Those are all game-changing technologies for the future. That's where the tech race is on with China, for example. If you want to be directly involved in the national security mission, we always need great people at DIU. So you can certainly write to me, michael@diu.mil. We're always looking for how can we bring in the best and the brightest to help with the national security mission directly. And there's also a sister organization that's managed by DIU. It's called the National Security Innovation Network. It's a network of 35 universities, probably most well known for teaching hacking for defense. There's a course that's a hacking for defense course that's offered at University of Pittsburgh that anyone at CMU can sign up for. And then Ensign offers several fellowships. There's an X-Force fellowship that we could talk about that anyone can apply to, which is a way to get involved with solving some defense problems as a summer project. And then there's a Technology and National Security fellowship. If you're interested in working full-time in national security, it's a one-year fellowship program that places folks in congressional offices and at senior leadership levels in DoD. Love to see more people pursue national security as a career option.
Yeah. So let's zoom out a bit. I know you just said that it is our country needs to invest more in R&D. Our country needs to do a lot more, but obviously our country is just a small piece of the larger global picture, right? And in general, the larger commercial global market is important for us to be not only aware of, but also be a part of and engaging to, again, strengthen our national security. So how does DIU view working with our partners and allies to mimic the commercial global market? And what are the issues that come with that? I know you mentioned that there's this constant competition with China, but there's also opportunities. So how do we play in this larger global market beyond our own countries?
Well, we need to be working with allies and partners in a much bigger way in technology. So a couple of things here. First of all, this is one of the three main pillars of the National Defense Strategy that was laid out in 2018. That is to strengthen the relationship with partners and allies. And you can see that in much of what Secretary Mattis did and how he spent his time, as well as Secretary Esper doing the same thing. So it's very important to our defense that we use the asymmetric advantage that we have in the US, which is allies. No other country really has that. So Russia doesn't have allies. China has one ally, and that's North Korea. So that's a real strength of our nation that we need to use. We all know, second, we all know we don't have a corner on innovation and technology development. So China has more people than we have. So if we want to make sure that we've got enough people thinking and working in these spaces, we've got to leverage the power that comes from the number of people in our allied countries and use those markets. That needs to inform our trade policy. We need to make sure that among those countries that are allied with us, there's a free flow of ideas, capital, and talent. That's the way we win. That's certainly why Silicon Valley is recognized and is successful as it has been, because we have been that attracting point for people, ideas, and talent.
So tell me a little bit.
I was just going to say, there's also an opportunity for DIU to directly carry out its mission with allies. And we have not been able to take advantage of this in our first 5 years, but it's something in our strategic planning, as Ritwik knows, that we have in mind. We'll need some mandate to do that. We'll need some resources to do that. But we've been approached by a lot of our allies, Sweden, France, the UK, Japan, India, Singapore. Many would like to be working with us because they want to see how we're incorporating technology into the military. Our military can benefit from drawing on startups in those countries. And then in turn, our own startups, those that we work with at DIU, we'd benefit a lot if we were opening those opportunities to foreign military sales and supplying allied military. So there's a tremendous opportunity here, which I'd love to get after. We just have not had the opportunity to do that yet.
So you mentioned you have the strong emphasis on technology, right? Like we need to work on a large technology market. what is the interplay? So again, as we're working with our international partners, what is the interplay between technology and policy, and what is our role, right, as technologists in that world of policy as well?
Well, if you believe like I do, the underpinnings for a strong economy really are technology. If we look at what's happened to the US economy from, you pick at the 1960s forward, we've been a leader in the world because we believe in science, and to be at the forefront of science is important because it's an underpinning for technology development, and that in turn has been a key to growing our economy. So just look at sectors like computing and network and storage, where I used to work, and now what that's led to in terms of the US being preeminent in software. So it's a fundamental belief that I have, and I don't think it's requires too much faith to say that to be at the forefront economically, we need to be investing in our own technology capability, proclaiming that we want to be preeminent in science, which I think we need to be much stronger about, encouraging STEM education, having multiple moonshots going on in our country to inspire young people to get academia, business, and government working together to really recreate what was at the formative years of Silicon Valley, was that kind of effort. So I think we need to be doing that again because we are in a tech race with China. We might not have asked for it, but we're in one. And that's what's going to make sure that we have the economic prosperity for the next 50 years, and that technology investment creates the spillover effects that will underpin that economic prosperity. Because national security is nothing if you don't have a strong economy. You can't name a country that is a very small economy, but yet is a leading world power. It just doesn't work that way. You need the scale, both from an investment standpoint and markets and manufacturing capability, to really be a leading power, exercising that and ensuring national security. They just go hand in hand.
So you actually mentioned the word moonshot, and you basically read the mind of one of our attendees who asked the question that what is the DoD doing in terms of concerted efforts to focus and develop our long-term moonshot goals? So the next space race, I know you mentioned AI a lot. You mentioned other opportunities like quantum and hypersonics. What are we doing in the next 25 to 50 years, and how does DIU's role, right, in the commercial world help us achieve those moonshots?
Well, if you look at the department and say, where are the moonshots, you'd have to point to DARPA. So DARPA has a long storied history, obviously going back to 1958. And it was really one of the innovations that the US develops as a response to Sputnik. Sputnik spurred a lot of creativity in this country. And while it's too bad that something that an adversary does creates you or spurs you to do something that you should be doing anyway, but that's the evolution of DARPA. So still, DARPA has the research capability to invest for 20-year time horizons. DARPA today is made up of many different projects. There's not a cohesive goal to get a lot of that wood behind one arrow and say, this is our moonshot. But that's where in the Department of Defense, the smaller moonshots are happening. And of course, the distinction is I'm calling for the US, from the president on down, to declare these are the 10 moonshots we need for AI, autonomous systems, biotechnology, clean energy. We need to usher in a whole new era of achievement in science and technology. That's what I'm asking for. So it would be on a bigger scale. DIU is working with the commercial technology that is available today. So our mission is about what's out there today to solve a current military need, and how do we get that as quickly as possible in the hands of those people who are putting their lives on the front line. We call them the warfighter. That's the soldiers, the sailors, the airmen who are out there doing missions for us. And a lot of those are humanitarian missions. Ridwood knows because he's worked on a couple of these projects. It's not just folks who are on the front line facing an enemy. It's also the U.S. military is the first on the scene whenever there's a disaster around the world. And Ridwood is working on a project that really is helping our firefighters in California get better information to support their efforts. That project has also been used to support first responders to hurricanes. So the military does a lot of missions. One of the most important ones these days is COVID-19. The National Guard's been called up in quite a few states to support COVID-19. There's a plan to distribute the vaccine as soon as that's available, that the military is behind. So a lot of really important missions serving the country that we often don't think about and associate with the military.
So to stay on that theme a little bit of again this idea of moonshots and R&D priorities. If I'm a student today and I want to again be at this cutting edge and I want to be involved in our next internet or our next microelectronics effort, what should I be focusing on today? And before you answer that, I'm going to merge that with a little bit of a question one of our audience members has is, once I understand what I'm supposed to be focused at, how do I actually start understanding the problem space of the DoD? Because from my perspective, I see commercial priorities, but I don't see DoD priorities. So those questions, so have at it.
Yeah, well, again, we talked about you're contributing to making the U.S. stronger by working commercially in these spaces. So we need the U.S. to continue to be a leader in AI, autonomy, biotech, you name it. You can look at these 20 different priorities that we just named again by the National Security Council. They were named in a document that talks about protecting them, but I would argue that more important than protecting them is making sure we're investing and we're leading in these spaces too. So you're helping our country be stronger by working in one of those technology spaces, even commercially. But if you want to get involved with the Defense Department and work directly on national security, we would love to have you as part of the Defense Department. An easy way to see if that's something that would interest you is to apply for one of these X-Force fellowships offered by National Security and Innovation Network. And I think the recruiting for next summer is going to start very soon.
So let me refocus the question a little bit, right? So it's not so much of how to get involved in national security. It's more the question is more along the lines of what should I be focusing on, right? So in DIU we have the 6 portfolios now focused on specific areas. So what are these topics I should be looking out for as a student where I will have massive impact in the next 25 years of my career?
Well, if you had to pick one, I'd say AI. But if you want to look at the full list, go and look up the National Security Council's recently published set of 20 technology priorities. And you'll see technologies that you'll recognize, from clean energy to advanced computing. It's a very good list. There's a similar list that's in front of Congress called the Endless Frontiers Act. It's sponsored by senators and congressmen, so bicameral and bipartisan. That hasn't passed yet, but they're asking for $100 billion in increased federally funded R&D to go through the National Science Foundation. So you'll see about 10 or 12 priorities there. They repeat themselves. They're all aiming at the similar areas. Again, if you had to pick one, it's AI/ML.
Got it. So for everyone, I did post a link to the Endless Frontiers Act in the chat that you guys can check out. So Mike, again, this has been a great discussion so far about kind of the opportunities in the DoD space. I want to talk a little bit more about what DIU has done. Could you tell us a little bit about kind of what has been your biggest achievement, and on the same side, what has been your biggest missed opportunity?
Well, as you well know, you don't get anything done without a team. So I would point to my biggest achievement personally has been assembling the great talent that we have. We're small in terms of only having 100 people, as I mentioned, but as we all know, you can do great things with small, well-working teams of folks. You don't need thousands of people to accomplish something great. So I'm very proud of the talent that we have at DIU. I often, as you know, call it an elite core. It's not just people that get assigned there. We recruit for specific capabilities and people. We want the absolute best helping us on our mission. Then if we said, okay, what has DIU accomplished besides assembling some great talent? We've really been focused on scaling what we've set out as our mission. So when I started leading DIU, I think we already had the concept of doing some projects, but we weren't focused on what we now call transformative projects. What projects can we do that go across services that have really big impact? So, okay, when we're smaller, we're a little bit scrappier, we're trying to get our legs underneath us, but now we need to make sure that we're creating more value for the department. So that's been about what can we do by picking the right projects, and then it's also what can we do to expand our capability to scale. So one of the keys for us was getting our own contracting capability, because since we're an organization that's trying to bring in commercial technology, we need to be able to contract for that. So without going into a lot of boring detail, we had to work with other organizations that had their own contracting capability. Well, they're never as responsive as you need. We were working, as an example, with a group that's buying Army tank shells and bullets that was buying about $60 billion of those a year. And we are doing contracts that are $1 to $3 million for prototypes. We couldn't get their attention. So very important to have our own contracting capability, our own contracting officers, and now we have a very competent staff there. So that's just one example of how can we scale the capability so that we can do more. We were fortunate enough to get a nice budget increase from Congress a year ago, 55% funding increase. That allows us to do more projects for the department. So we're really trying to take something that was a model. As you know, one of the things that we use is something called a commercial solutions opening. That's a fancy word for a process that's competitive, that goes out and seeks the best of industry. We could have a bake-off to make sure that we're working with the best there, and we put those companies on a prototype contract and see what they can do. We don't buy slideware. We actually test them in a military application, and then if you prove yourself successfully, then there's a production contract waiting for you at the other end. So that process of commercial solutions opening, we've refined now and made sure that we can do on an ongoing basis. And we're attracting more and more companies. I mean, one of the things that we're trying to change is the notion that it's difficult to do business with the Department of Defense. So there's no denying that it is, and we're trying to make that easier. The last project we solicited for, which was this swarm of drones, artificial intelligence for small unit maneuver, as you know, we had 111 companies respond to us for that project. So that's an enormous step forward relative to where we were 3 or 4 years ago, when we had to shake a lot of cages to get people to respond. Now people know that we have a track record of being able to deliver production contracts for successful companies, and that helps attract them.
Help me put that in context, right? Because if you tell me, right, that one of the coolest things DA's done is contracting, I'm gonna yawn and be like, okay, cool, right? Like that's not sexy AI. That's not like the best new quantum sensor. So what is in context of the DoD, why is this contract ability so cool? Like how fast can DIU ship, go from one of these CSOs to, let's say, a product that's in the hands of a warfighter making a difference?
Yeah. Well, that's a great point. So that's why that's a technology for us to scale, or a process for us to scale, as opposed to, I wouldn't say that's the most exciting thing that we've done is create a process. But what does that allow us to do? Let's talk about a couple of examples. So a few we've already talked about. How can we be pioneering swarms of drones? For NORAD recently, a project that's completed, we fused sensor data that was giving a siloed or stovepipe picture to NORAD. As you all know, that is the command that understands what's happening in North American airspace. Been around since the Cold War. We want to understand if the U.S. were seeing an incoming missile attack. How terrible that those folks had siloed data that they couldn't see and spent most of the 12 minutes that the president would have to respond to an incoming attack trying to understand what they were looking at. So we flipped that around so that we now in about 1 or 2 minutes of that 12 can understand with a common operating picture what are the sensors telling us about our airspace. Using these microscopes that really are helping the radiologists spot cancer earlier with augmented reality. We're working on autonomous barges that will really be the antidote to the South China Sea islands. What if we had floating islands that could be deployed there that support electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft? another project we're working on. We're doing additive manufacturing with concrete. So the Marines are looking at how could we better build forward bases. Now there's 3D printing that can happen with concrete to build barracks, bridges, those kind of things. So the technology that we get to work on, as you well know, is quite cool. I couldn't be more enthused about the projects that we're doing. We didn't really talk about space. There's a lot that's happening in the commercial space field. DIU has been pioneering the combination of rocket launch as a service. So think about the business model change where the government paid for every rocket launch in the Apollo program, to now many private companies like a SpaceX, as we just saw this summer, are sending rockets into space. We can buy a portion of that payload space as a service. We don't have to schedule government-owned rockets. We're also sponsoring satellites that can see day and night and through cloud. They're called synthetic aperture radar. So these are commercial data that we're able to take and analyze, and we're also sponsoring some companies that are using analysis, including machine learning, to look at the commercial imagery and be able to help us highlight things. For example, if Chinese ships are in the Pacific transferring oil to North Korean tankers, now we're able to see that because we have better what's called revisit rates. It's really more continuous look at dark areas that we couldn't see before, and we can get resolution, again, day or night or through clouds, of what's happening there. This is capability that for situational awareness that we've not had before. So first time in history that is going to be available to us. A lot of interesting projects. I couldn't be more enthused about it.
That's awesome. Yeah. So you mentioned earlier on in response that one of the things you're most proud of is, again, curating this rich and diverse talent base at DIU that's really been able to make a huge impact on kind of what DIU is able to deliver to the DoD. Talent management as a whole, as I'm sure you're aware, is an issue for the DoD, right? We're not able to always recruit the best. We're not always able to retain the best. So one of our attendees is asking the question is how does, he said DIU, I'll open that question up to DoD, stay competitive with recruiting college grads compared to our private tech companies, right? Because not all the R&D, as you mentioned, is done at private tech companies. So what is our mechanism to recruit and retain?
So I think about that twofold. One is we're not going to be able to get all the talent we need. A lot of folks who are very talented are going to go to the commercial sector. We just have to make sure we're accessing what those commercial companies are doing. We don't have to own all of that development ourselves. So to some extent, I'm glad to see people go into those fields as long as DoD figures out with DIU and other mechanisms how do we tap into that. But more specifically to the question about what do we need to do at DoD, we need to think about offering folks a career path that is flexible. You might want to start at a DIU or somewhere else in DoD and then transition to private sector. The mechanisms are not as flexible as they need to be, and it's unlikely we're going to be able to attract people to come for 30 or 40 years the way maybe as the systems were designed when in the 1960s when Robert McNamara was defense secretary. That was a little more the way people approached their career at that time. One thing I will say, though, is I find that we often think about the money isn't as good in government, and it's not. You're not going to join DIU because the money is great.
I can confirm.
but the challenges are awesome, and the people are phenomenal to work with, and you're going to learn an incredible amount. So the mission is really quite a driver of getting great talent. So I think if we just put a little more attention on recruiting the best and having more spots for them, we need more organizations like DIU or the Joint AI Center that can attract some of this great talent and fully utilize it. Then I think the mission is quite compelling. We're not going to ever be able to offer the same compensation, but if we think about their time there as flexible and then going on to do something in the commercial world, and then maybe even coming back, like I've come back later in my career, I think we could have a much better model for talent rather than thinking, oh, we got to attract someone and keep them in their chair for 40 years. It's hard to keep learning for 40 years if you're not changing your circumstance, your environment, the people you're working with. That's what keeps you learning. And frankly, that would make that employee more valuable to DoD if we could structure that. A lot of work to do in that area.
Got it. So someone asked this earlier, and I typed them up an answer, but I think this plays perfectly. If so, you know, in our audience, not only do we have students, we have some faculty members at Silicon Valley. Hey, Ian, I see you there, and a bunch of other people part of our industry here. So if I had a company and I wanted to go work with DIU, how do I get involved? What's the process for me to learn about a solicitation, join a solicitation? Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, I always appreciate that question. We're always looking for more capable suppliers to DoD, and we've been able to introduce 66 companies to DoD for the very first time. So we're all about taking smaller, more innovative, less traditional defense suppliers and getting them connected to DoD opportunities. So we have a commercial engagement team. This is a team that is focused on understanding the landscape within different technology areas. AI is one of those, autonomous systems is another, commercial space is another. So we have folks in these teams that are responsible for understanding the landscape, who are the companies, what are they doing, and then when a solicitation happens, which basically means we're solving a problem, then we already know who are some of the leading companies out there. So the person responsible for that is Tom Foldesi. I'll give you his email right here. It's tfoldesi@diu.mil. Tom's a former SEAL and former banker, investment banker with Credit Suisse, so fantastic background for DIU. And he leads that commercial engagement team to make sure that we're working with the leading American company. So if you have one of those companies or you know one that we should be working with, please let us know. We're always trying to expand our network. The solicitations we do, as Ridley knows, are open though. Anyone's welcome to compete for those. And in fact, sometimes companies from other countries compete for those. And if you're from an allied country like a Canada or New Zealand, Australia, you can even win those. Don't bother applying if you're from Russia or China. We're not going to pick you. But if you're from one of our allies, you're in the consideration set.
Awesome. So that's an interesting point, right? So obviously we're in a competition with Russia and China, but there's a lot of innovation and innovative people coming out of Russia and China. So CMU, as you know, has a very large international student body, as well as a lot of other campuses like Stanford and Berkeley. So how do we bring everyone together? How do we get international collaboration going across our campuses and eventually for our national security apparatus?
Well, I feel very strongly that attracting international talent is important for our country. We already talked earlier today about immigration and how important that is, how that led to the success of Silicon Valley being a magnet for talent from around the world. So very important that we attract that talent and then keep that talent here in the US. I wish it were easier for folks to stay and continue to work here in the US. Sometimes we make that more difficult than probably we should for our own economic benefit. But we certainly need the talent from everywhere working on some of these problems, working in these fields that can then benefit us. Our issues from a national security standpoint are not with Chinese or Russian people, it's with their governments. So we just have to make sure that we're doing the right thing from a national security standpoint and not helping those governments which are very repressive, are horrible abusers of human rights, don't have a very strong record of doing the right thing or doing good things in the world. We can't be enabling their success.
Right. So I'm going to go back. There's a lot of go backs, but someone just asked a question about what quality do you see as most promising? What are the most promising qualities of an early stage startup in the defense space? So you mentioned our solicitations are open. We're not just working with the biggest and brightest, tech companies that already have established leverage in the commercial space. So if I'm an early stage startup, how do I get DIU's attention? How do I compete in this market?
So it's a couple of things. First of all, you get our attention by working on technologies relevant for one of our problems. We already mentioned there's a couple of different areas that we focus in: AI, commercial space, autonomy, human systems or health, cyber. So those are the 5 areas, and we just added a 6th one this year for advanced energy and materials. So those are very broad areas, but those are the ones where we're working. I lost my train of thought there. So for those spaces, we're looking for all companies that would have something relevant for the problems that we might work on. So the things that we look for, that's number one, kind of the relevant technology space. There could be other technology spaces that we likely would not be focused on. 2, do you have a commercial base that you're supplying? Because we're not looking to produce future defense contractors or future companies that only work with defense. We're trying to leverage what you're doing in the commercial sector. So if you've got a successful commercial business, that's also a positive. And 3rd, are you already at the stage where you have a prototype, which basically means you have something that we could take that is at least at a beta level version that we could test in a military application. So prototype doesn't mean, are you at a stage where you've prototyped something early on and maybe you'll get to your product later? You already have a product that we can test in a military application. So those, I think, would be the 3 most important factors.
Got it. We've talked a lot. We've covered a lot of topics, so let's take a breath. Certainly talked about a lot of things. Are there any closing thoughts that you'd want to leave with us? I know, again, as I mentioned, there's staff, students, faculty in our attendee list. So anything that you'd like to leave as a message before we wrap up?
I think that this mission that we're on at DIU is part of, which is really how do we make the military more effective, is really part of a broader mission for the country on how do we lead in the key technology areas for the future. And if we went down the list of where's China leading or where's Russia leading, fortunately Russia's not leading in too many things, we would find that there's a lot more that China is catching up to us on. AI, they're not far behind us. I just heard Eric Schmidt's assessment, they're 2 years behind us in AI. Some people would say they're closer than that. But for us to be able to continue to lead so that we can have a very successful economy for the next 30 or 40 years so that we can in turn protect our national security requires continued investment in these spaces. People's investment of their time, we talked about federally funded R&D, companies making investments. It's critical for our prosperity and our national security to continue to lead in these spaces. To the extent that you are working in these spaces, I'm cheering you on. We really need you. We need the U.S. to be effective leaders in these technologies, and we need your contribution to national security, which in some cases comes from ensuring that the U.S. is leading the technology and we have a vibrant economic sector in these technologies. Critically important for our future.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I certainly think that the students are going to be coming out of CMU and these places have seen kind of the impacts that they've had with their research and kind of the ventures of the students around them. So I think that keeping this mission in mind is going to be critical for our future. So, well, Mike, I mean, it's been a fascinating time here. Thank you as always for the talk. It's always a good time to talk to you. For anyone in the attendees list, I know Mike mentioned, if anyone has more questions, feel free to reach out to him at michael@die.mil. We're always happy to engage with, not only students, but faculty and staff who are thinking about spinning out startups and want to be more involved in the national security space. Mike also mentioned getting involved with Ensign, the National Security Innovation Network, for not just more opportunities to work in the national security space, but also for fellowships and other educational opportunities. So with no further ado, thank you so much, Mike. It's been great having you here.
Right. Been a pleasure talking to you, Redwick.
Oh, one more thing I'll add is please follow DIU on social media. So there's not only a LinkedIn where we share a lot of our information to the solicitations and opportunities, but there's also a Twitter and I think a Facebook. So I don't know about that one. But definitely Twitter and a LinkedIn. So please follow DIU and we'll share more information there.